Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
Namaskar. Welcome to another episode of Editorial. Okay, I'm not going to waste your time or my guest's time to kind of introduce my guest to you because the person I'm talking about is an international celebrity. So I'm going to talk to Shashi Tharoor about his new book, The Battle of Belonging. It's a brilliant book. So few questions. Let's talk to him. Let's get right into the show. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And thank you so much for authoring such a lovely book. It's a brilliantly written book, sir. But I have a lot of questions. My first question is, you've actually created a distinctive difference between patriotism and nationalism. Why have you done that, sir?
Well, because, first of all, the entire debate about nationalism that has arisen in the recent past in India is because of the government's fondness for dismissing their enemies as anti-national. And we've got to a point where the Prime Minister is equated to the ruling party is equated to the government is equated to the state is equated to the nation. So you criticize anybody along that chain and the entire chain is anti-national. That's not the way democracy is supposed to work. And I've often argued, quoting a famous old line that says, patriotism is loving your country all the time and supporting your country all the time, but supporting your government only when it deserves it.
Correct.
I don't think that patriotism necessarily involves your having to constantly demonstrate your loyalty to the country by supporting every decision of the governments. But this is something which this government has particularly tried to do. Now, what I've been arguing about this is that patriotism essentially is very different from nationalism because patriotism is only about love of your country. You love your country the way in which you love your mother. It doesn't actually involve your feeling that it has to be perfect in any way. It's simply you feel you belong there. You feel it belongs to you. It's your country. And therefore, as far as you're concerned, you love your country. That's patriotism. And that can also accommodate loving your country in a rather more limited sense. That is starting off with the part of the country you grew up in, you identify with, what I've described as local patriotisms, and extending to a love of the whole, which is a sum total of your and all your fellow Indians' local patriotisms. Now, the difference is that a nationalist, pure and simple, is often anchoring his nationalism in a sense of identity and a loyalty to a state. So I've written in the book, a patriot is prepared to die for his country, while a nationalist is ready to kill for his state. And these are two very different concepts. We must reclaim the idea of nationalism linked to patriotism as love of country, which should include love of social justice, living with others, accepting differences with others, inclusivity, so that no Indian has to feel that they have to feel in any way worried about their sense of belonging to the country. And at the same time, nationalism, in my mind, should be anchored in what I've called civic nationalism. There is a voluntary sense of belonging wrought by, amongst other things, constitutions and institutions, not just saying, I'm an Indian and therefore I must show allegiance to one particular set of policies, one particular government, one particular set of approaches to defining what is Indianness and what is the belonging to India.
So, Doctor, then it's not like nationalism is bad and patriotism is good. That's not what you're exactly saying here. What you're saying is civic nationalism is good and possibly majoritarian nationalism is bad. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So, in fact, in the first 100 pages of the book, Sujit, I actually describe the theory, concept, and evolution of nationalism around the world, from the very beginnings of time to what we are seeing today. And I argue that various kinds of nationalism that emerge from immutable facts of birth, immutable facts of identity, whether it's your religion, your race, your language, your color of skin, your ethnicity, all of these things, which I summarize under one lump heading as ethno-religio linguistic nationalism. that kind of nationalism is bad because it is always targeted against someone, somebody inside your country, a minority, for example, or somebody who disagree with you, a dissenter. Those are the people you target inside, and then you turn your nationalism against people outside to show the superiority of your beliefs and your state. Now, that kind of nationalism is, to my mind, bad. It is indeed majoritarian because the nation is constructed in the name and in the image of the majority. But civic nationalism moves beyond that. You know, just even 30, 40 years ago, you would have said a German, by definition, is somebody who's white, Christian, and speaks German. I mean, those three things were, without those three, you couldn't be German, or the same with French, or same with Danish.
Correct.
Today, all these societies are evolving towards greater civic nationalism, where people of other religions, other colors of skin, and even other mother tongues, other educations, are migrating to these countries and have been accepted to greater and lesser degree by the population, by the state, and they are allowed to remain and indeed welcome to remain as long as they participate in the civic nationalism that they have been admitted into. Tomorrow, if you were to migrate to America, it wouldn't matter that you're not white. It wouldn't matter that you don't sound like them, don't look like them. It wouldn't matter that you don't actually have even an education in that country. Whatever it may be, once you have gone in there and taken their passport, you have subscribed to the American civic nationalism. And that is the distinction between the two kinds of nationalism I'm talking about. There is the civic nationalism that anyone can subscribe to, be part of, as long as they accept the democratic assumptions underpinning this, the inclusivity, the institutions, the constitutional structure, all of that. They can participate on equal footing, whereas the other kind of nationalism, you are by default excluded by the mere accident of your birth into the wrong religion or the wrong color or the wrong language or whatever, and either you're completely excluded or you're reduced to a kind of second-class citizenship. Now that is the kind of nationalism I consider bad, and civic nationalism I consider good. And what is more, I think most democracies are either already civic nationalist democracies or are evolving towards a civic nationalism.
Let me try and put this into context. How would you rate Atal Bihari Vajpayee, for instance? How would you rate his nationalism? And
So
what would his nationalism be?
his convictions, Sujit, I'm afraid emerge from the same stable, the
Correct.
same RSS doctrines of Savarkar, Golwalkar, Deen Dayal Upadhyay, as Mr. Modi's and Mr. Amit Shah's have also emerged. So to that degree, in theory, there was no real difference. But there were two important differences with Mr. Vajpayee. First was his own temperament, which was by nature more accommodating and more respectful of those who disagreed with him. And that certainly would have played a part in his ability to recognize merits in others and to accept the legitimacy of their involvement.
But doctor, did that
And the second
stem-
factor,
so-
Sujit,
sorry,
second
just-
factor, Sujit, is that he never actually had a majority government. The BJP was a minority that needed to work with parties that didn't share his Hindutva, and therefore he had to temper his ideological convictions in the interests of running an efficient government. And that too would have reduced the application of his nationalism. So his theoretical convictions were no different, but the way in which he implemented them are very different from what we are seeing with these two gentlemen today.
So, Doctor, you saying that if Vajpayee was currently the Prime Minister, Vajpayee had the same privilege that Modi has, would he be different?
I think there would only have been a difference of style, and that style is very important because Mr. Vajpayee, for example, that obituary speech he made in the Lok Sabha when Nehruji died is an amazing speech, or the speech he made to Indira Gandhi when she won the Bangladesh war. These are not things you expect to hear from any BJP leader today about any Congress leader, even when the BJP is in power and the Congress is in power. But Mr. Vajpayee's temperament was such, I would agree with you that I think he would quite possibly have actually spoken like that even today. So the style would have been different. But with a BJP majority, I don't think that he would have demurred at implementing the policies of the present BJP government, the majoritarian policies that are taking the country towards a Hindu Rashtra. Because he never disavowed the Hindu Rashtra philosophy, even when he was not implementing it or pursuing it.
One more example I want to ask you. The second
Sure.
name I would say is OAC. How would you rate him?
Well, you have to ask yourself whether you are looking at what Owaisi says or what Owaisi does. What Owaisi says is classic democratic stuff. I mean, he talks about secularism, inclusiveness. He talks about individual rights. He's constantly upholding the Constitution. I believe he's a lawyer by training because he often cites the law, cites the Constitution. So, in terms of what he says and the speeches, the very effective speeches he makes in Parliament and outside, I find that he is in fact saying, I take the institutions of India's civic nationalism seriously, and I want you to give me and my people the rights that we are entitled to under India's civic nationalism. To that degree, he is in the civic nationalist category. Now, if you ask many analysts, and I'm only not only talking about slightly embittered Congress party loyalists, people will say that the net effect of his present approach has been to do the BJP two favors. Number one, by undercutting the votes of the established secular parties, and number two, by polarizing Muslim voters to such a degree that it creates a backlash of Hindu polarization for the BJP. And therefore, these analysts will tell you that from their point of view, what Mr. Owaisi is doing is actually facilitating majoritarianism. And that is a different political conversation. I don't go into those
Fair
analyses in the book. But in terms of what he says, he stands for the exact same things that I stand for.
Doctor, is nationalism evolving? Does it change? And if it changes,
well,
if it changes,
go on.
then can you create nationalism? Can you create a pattern? Like you create brand proposition. You spoke about Coke and Coke Light. So can you create a brand proposition? Can there be a Congress nationalism versus a BJP nationalism versus a communist nationalism? Like you have a Coke proposition, you have a Pepsi proposition, you have a Thumbs Up proposition. Can that happen?
Well, Sujit, you phrased it very interestingly. I would say that for 70 years, this was not even a debate, or at least from 1947 to at least 2014, so 67 years, I don't think anybody challenged the concept of India's nationalism within India. Neither those who came to power under Congress, nor under Janta, nor under BJP, nor under Janata Dal, United Front, everybody subscribed to this vision of a pluralist democracy anchored in multiple parties, multiple identities, coexistence of all religions, coexistence of various castes. Of course, there were different ways in which the pie was cut and distributed, or there were different ways in which many political interests could be bargaining with each other. But at the end of the day, everyone was treated as equally legitimate. So to that degree, I would argue that there wasn't any fundamental debate about what Indian nationalism was. What has happened, I think, now is that nationalism, which is a nationalism that is enshrined in the Constitution of India and that I describe as a civic nationalism, has been fundamentally challenged by those who have been in power since 2014. And they are trying to evolve Indian nationalism in a majoritarian direction. They're very consciously saying that this is a country principally of, for, and by the Hindu people, that others are either guests here or interlopers and bandits, and that they will be treated accordingly. And this is core to the RSS thinking and the way they've indoctrinated their followers for almost 100 years. So there's nothing terribly surprising about it. It's just that to see it actually being articulated by people in power, enjoying the reins of governance, and in a position to promote and pass legislation to give legal effect to their thinking, all of that is very new and I would argue somewhat worrying.
Doctor, can I rephrase what you just said? From a marketing perspective, what you just said is Bharatiya Janata Party created this nationalism, propagated this nationalism, sold this nationalism, which India bought. And currently, that nationalism is the most prevailing nationalism in India. I mean, let's face facts, they are the governing party. So, is that
37% of the vote, Sujit?
37%. Fair enough.
Of the vote.
Fair enough. Just for a discussion sake. Just for a discussion sake. They have sold the nationalism, and that nationalism is what is currently being spoken about. Now, is that a fact? Is that the way?
See,
Can I simplify
I have
it
some
that way?
difficulty with that proposition. I have some difficulty with that proposition for the simple reason that when you look at that 37%, yes, the other 63 are very divided, but they are certainly a majority, and I believe they still believe in what we would call civic nationalism. The BJP's nationalism is the nationalism of the Hindutva movement, which sees India as a Hindu Rashtra, has been animated by the old RSS slogan of Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. This is something which is the ethno-religious nationalism that I've discussed in the book and decried in the book.
Correct.
This is a conception of nationalism in which belonging and love for country is determined by identity markers, facets of your personhood that you're born into, your religion, your language, your ethnicity, and so on. Now, this sort of nationalism that the BJP espouses is not the nationalism of the Constitution. So,
Right.
clearly, this is a different brand, if you want to call it that, of nationalism. It is nationalism for and of the majority population as defined by the BJP. But many Hindus I know have no difficulty in saying you can be a good Hindu, a good Keralite, a good Indian at the same time. You can also be a good Muslim, a good Bengali, and a good Indian at the same time.
Correct.
The point is you can be many things in one thing, in civic nationalism. But from people like Mr. Amit Shah, that second proposition is not acceptable because as far as he is concerned, according to his speeches in the Lok Sabha at the time of the CAA, that once partition had happened and the country was partitioned, India was no longer a country in which Muslims had the same rights as others. Now, to my mind, that proposition flies against the very premises of India's nationalism as articulated and defended not only by Mahatma Gandhi with his Raghupati Raghava Raja Ram, Ishwara Allah Tero Naam, but it's also the nationalism that all the founding fathers agreed upon after extensive debates in the Constituent Assembly and established in the Constitution of India. These same people who are now paying so much allegiance to Dr. Ambedkar, at least lip service to Dr. Ambedkar, will they not realize the fundamental concept of the Constitution that he bequeathed to this nation? You and I are speaking on the day the BJP has declared to be Constitution Day, the day the drafting process was concluded on 26 September 1949. And the truth is that that Constitution is a constitution that gives everybody certain rights of equality under Indian nationhood. That is what, unfortunately, is being undermined with the BJP brand of exclusionary, arbitrary, and frankly discriminatory notions of nationalism, where essentially they're saying you have to meet criteria that we will lay down to be declared a good Indian. And that kind of civic nationalism doesn't grant any government of the day the right to tell you whether you are any more entitled than they are to call yourself Indian. Do you remember, Sujit, there was this child during the Shaheen Bagh protests holding up a poster. Yes. And this girl said, I mean, girl, when I say girl, she was probably a teenage girl. She was holding up a poster saying, "Who gave you the right to tell me I'm not Indian?" And that is a really fundamental question that civic nationalists would answer differently from Hindu Rashtra nationalists.
Correct.
This girl was wearing a hijab.
Correct. Doctor, I want to go back to my earlier question. Doctor, somewhere down the line, 38% of Indians are today accepting this nationalism. Now, my question is, has India, was the 68 years of India where secular was almost natural to everybody an aberration, or are these 6 years an aberration? Were Indians communal by birth, and we just had this possibly the after effect of independence and Gandhi and all that, and when it came down, when all of it went off, you had this communalism that just sprung up. Is that the way it is, Doctor?
Well, I mean, I would say that if we had asked, you and I were having this conversation in 1947, it would have actually made more sense, because the country was partitioned because a party claiming to speak for the Muslims of India said they had the right to be a separate country. There was horrendous killing, slaughter. 13 million people had to leave their homes and cross both borders. 1 million people were killed. All of these terrible things happened. And at that time, you could well say, now we have claimed we have thousands of years of history of being tolerant. Nehru writes Discovery of India about all of us living together. Gandhiji sings his bhajans. Doesn't 1947 prove that we're really communal? Well, the Pakistanis gave one answer to that question. The Indians gave another answer. And the Indian leaders of 47 said, no, our freedom struggle was always for everybody. And even if one country has been created for Muslims alone, we will never buy into the logic of Pakistan by saying that what remains is a country of the Hindus alone. That is not what our freedom struggle was about. We fought for everyone. We will build a country for everyone. And that's what is reflected in the Constitution. These are people who are witnessing the horrendous horrors of communal killings. We've had nothing comparable to what happened in 47 in our lives in 2014 or 19 for that matter. What we are seeing right now is a far more cold-blooded communalism that is in pursuit of an ideology. It is not even genuinely a visceral reaction to killings or breakdown of law and order or violence or whatever. And it's often based on myths, Sujit. It's on myths arguing, for example, that the Muslims have been appeased and spoiled. If they are the beneficiaries of so much appeasement from various Congress governments, why are they still amongst the poorer segments of our society, people who in many ways are underrepresented in our police forces, in our army, in our judiciary, in all our higher echelons of our society, and are overrepresented in our prisons? To my mind, the Muslim community bears no indications of having been a favored community. And yet this myth is being propagated in order to justify demonizing them as the other with a capital O and promoting this intolerant version of nationalism in the name of Hindutva. To my mind, that's really, really shocking and shameful.
Doctor, from one Malayali to another, I want to ask you a question. Doctor, is this book your rebuttal to BJP nationalism, or did you author this book to genuinely define nationalism and patriotism?
Both. I mean, it starts off very much as an exercise in trying to define nationalism. I was very interested, and many of our of your listeners will already know that there are two great classic essays about nationalism in the 20th century that are not by scholars but are written for intelligent thinking people like you and me, I hope. And that is the essay by Tagore, which actually is a compilation of essays on nationalism in 5 different parts of the world. But nationalism generally emerges brilliantly through Tagore's writings and speeches. And the other one is George Orwell, who has a much shorter essay on nationalism. And both of them converge at many points. And what I thought was, it would be interesting now that we see how nationalism is being raised and hammered away at and frankly distorted in India today, it would be interesting to revisit these old ideas. So I reread Tagore and Orwell, I had read in my college days. And then I decided, let me see what the scholars think about all this. There's been so much more literature since these two venerable gentlemen wrote. And I started looking at all the contemporary scholarship on nationalism. And then I said, really, there must be a new book that explains nationalism to the kind of people who read editorials in the newspapers, op-ed articles in the newspapers, rather than it being reduced to the Bharat Mata Ki Jai kind of nationalism that we see from the BJP leadership. And at the same time, rather than it being left only to the academics in the classrooms who will come up with fancy theories, but none of us will allow them to influence our lives. So that's when the anchoring it against the BJP's kind of nationalism of the last 6 years also became important. So both elements came in, Sujit. On the one hand, there was this reflection on nationalism going back to the essays of Tagore and Orwell and the subsequent scholarship on it and all that. And there is also, secondly, a rebuttal to the BJP's distortion of Indian nationalism and the contribution that I've tried to make by saying, let us make a useful distinction between patriotism and civic nationalism on the one hand and majoritarian ethno-religious nationalism on the other. That distinction, I hope most ordinary people will be able to understand, relate to, and apply it to their own understanding of our country's political debates.
Okay. I want to get into another part of your book wherein you spoke about your son accepting the American passport. And Do you actually believe, Doctor, that if somebody accepts another passport, takes another nationality, they cut all ties with their country? They
No,
cease
of
to
course I
be.
don't. He can't cut ties with me.
No, no, no,
But
no.
no,
What I meant
the
is.
fact is not just that. The fact is that, you see, many people like him, and I've quoted him in the book, say, we wish India allowed dual nationality. We don't want to stop being Indian. Why doesn't India, unlike, say, America, Pakistan, Britain, many countries which allow dual citizenship, why doesn't India allow it? Well, that's a debate that has never properly been held. When I was an NRI, I raised this issue in the Pravasi Bharatiya Saman 15 years ago, 16 years ago, but there's no traction in the political class. I had to fight a bit within the government even to get NRIs, Indian passport holding NRIs, the right to vote. We are very, very narrow minded on these issues in the Indian establishment, cutting across all parties. So if you are giving up a country's passport, then obviously you can no longer call yourself an Indian patriot. If you're no longer holding an Indian passport, to my mind, your patriotism is now transferred to another country.
So is your
If there is a
patriotism
national
over,
anthem
therefore?
played, it is to that one that you have to stand. If there is a war being fought, it is that country you'll have to fight for. I mean, undoubtedly there is a certain loss of allegiance. Of course there is.
So that's over, as in you saying that there is no longer any sort of love lost for that country?
No, love is there, affinity is there, cultural ties are there, culinary ties are there. Often, many American passport holding Indians I know are actually people who are much more comfortable wearing Indian clothes, eating Indian food, cooking Indian food at home, etc., etc. In many cases, they may be more comfortable in an Indian language than in the American English they have to speak in their new country. But they've taken American passports. To my mind, as long as their principal allegiance is to another country, there is something lost in the process. I'm not saying they're not capable of loving our country. Of course they can. But they love another country more or enough more to give up our country's allegiance.
So therefore, I wanted to draw your attention to what you wrote about Sonia Gandhi. At some point in time, isn't there, I mean, are you saying that Sonia Gandhi, as an Indian, when she took the Indian passport, she has completely given up her allegiance, her love, her affinity towards Italy?
Her allegiance to Italy, she's definitely given up. I'm sure that her sort of emotional connections, her cultural connections, those will always be there. But there is no doubt in my mind that by giving up the Italian passport and taking the Indian, she was saying that my patriotism, my nationalism is now Indian nationalism. And that's precisely the irony that the very BJP people who are now attacking Sonia Gandhi, saying that she's really Italian, are discounting the value of the Indian passport, whereas many of the BJP supporters sitting abroad holding foreign passports and writing and speaking and funding the dangerous intolerance of the Hindutva movement, they are the ones who have actually given up their allegiance to our country.
Is having cultural ties with another country, does that make you lesser patriot? Does that make you lesser nationalist?
No. I mean, as I said, I mean, it's not only my son, by the way. I also have a sister who's American, therefore a niece and a grandniece are American, a nephew is American. These are all people who have these passports, but who are my blood, flesh and blood, my family. We often get together across borders and across passports in our ancestral home in Kerala, all of us together sharing family bonds, which, they say blood is thicker than passports or citizenships, but the truth is those connections cannot be diluted by the choice of another passport. But the allegiance, the political allegiance does change. I have absolutely no question. Let's say if tomorrow, God forbid that this should happen, but if we were at war with America, yes, my country's, my loyalty to my country means that I would have to, for that duration of that war, treat my son as an enemy. I don't mean that I would shoot him or I would try and harm him personally, but I would say that I cannot, shall we say, overlook the fact that your country is at war with mine. So these are very important choices one makes when one picks another country. Fortunately, he has chosen a country that I think we're very unlikely ever to be at war with. But imagine, say, what happened in 71 when the USS Enterprise sailed towards the Bay of Bengal. If that kind of thing were to happen again, what would you choose? His duty is to choose the country of his new allegiance. My duty and my loyalty is to my country.
Correct. Doctor, my last question to you. Like you said, nationalism evolves. It's evolved since past. It's a different proposition now, and it's evolving. Where do you see Indian nationalism going, assuming that all this continues for the next 5 years?
Well, this is the struggle. This is the battle for belonging that's going on, Sujit. I think that if the BJP is allowed to take the concept of Indian nationalism in the direction in which they want to take it, then you're going to end up with a very majoritarian Hindu Rashtra,
But
in which Muslims basically will be told they live here on sufferance.
Doctor, just to interrupt you here, Congress and other parties seems to have a lot of other brand propositions when you go for elections. BJP somehow seems to be focused on a single brand proposition, that is their nationalism, which is their Hindutva, which is their national pride. So that seems to be a single proposition, single-minded proposition. Somewhere down the line, assuming this continues and people still start buying it, I'm saying the majority, 37%, still starts buying it. Where do you see India and India's nationalism going? Obviously, education and everything is under their...
You and I should probably have a different conversation on that question, because my counter argument would be that the Indian voter is also capable one day of waking up and voting in his or her economic self-interest, which is what most voters do in most countries. So why would a young man who has voted for the BJP expecting to be given a job still vote for him again when he has no job still? Or why would somebody who has been thrown out of a job during the record unemployment that this government has presided over be grateful to vote for a government merely because they say Bharat Mata ki jai and thump their 56-inch chest and talk about the flag? At some point, people will say, what is my economic self-interest? Am I better off after I voted for this party? Those questions, I think, should not be overlooked. And therefore, I would counter-argue that even though they have that one proposition, that proposition will wear thin because of their inability to demonstrate any record of performance on the things that actually make a difference to people's material lives. And that's where the Congress party must not only give a counter proposition on the nationalism brand, but must also remind people that they were better off under Congress rule. They had jobs, they had financial security, they had food, all of which was affordable and reasonable, and they had rights granted to them. Their views were respected. There was an RTI that was actually properly functioning and not emasculated. We would say that essentially we will tell you that we are a government, we have shown you we are a government that can do all the things that for all these years the BJP has failed to do for you. So that value proposition, that is the alternative message to give, which is not to say that we should also not challenge the BJP's nationalism. We should. I believe strongly that the Congress should stand up for the civic nationalism that I've described in the book, and that is part of our constitution. To my mind, it is important that we stand up for this also. But let me stress to you, Sujit, that our proposition must be also to remind people it is not in their self-interest to vote for this party that has let them down so badly since 2014.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you so much for talking to us. It was indeed a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Jay.